Good morning, class. Mrs. Weidlich is going to read Chapter 6 of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. It's called The Never Want to Go to Bedders Cure. I hope that is not you guys during this time. Each evening as the clock struck 8, Mrs. Gray called Bobby and Larry and Susan. She said, "Come, children, 8 o'clock and time for bed." She tried to make her voice sound cheerful and happy, but actually she felt like groaning because she knew what was coming. First, Susan. "Oh, we don't want to go to bed now. Please let us stay up a little while longer. Please, Mother, please." Then Bobby. "We are the only ones in our whole neighborhood who have to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Larry. "Mother, nobody, not anybody at all, goes to bed at 8 o'clock. Then Susan again. "But Mother, we have only just started this game." Then Bobby. "Please let us finish this game, please." Then Larry. "Just one more turn, Mother. It's my turn, Mother, and I haven't won a game this evening. Please." Mrs. Gray said, "Now, Bobby, Larry, and Susan, you know that if you want to grow up into fine young men and women, you must have plenty of sleep. I'm sure they teach you that in school." "We don't want to grow up. We just want to finish this game," Bobby wailed. And so, night after night, poor Mrs. Gray argued and pled and begged her children to go to bed, and by the time they had finished whining and complaining, it was usually almost 9 o'clock. Mrs. Gray was desperate. Finally, one day, she called her friend, Mrs. Grassfeather. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Grassfeather, this is Mrs. Gray, and I would like to find out what time Catherine and Wilfred go to bed." Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Why, at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Gray, unless their Uncle Jasper comes for dinner, and then I usually let them stay up until 9:30 to hear Uncle Jasper tell about his experiences in the Boer War. That, of course, is strictly Mr. Grassfeather's idea. He not only allows the children to stay up until 9:30, but he pays them as well for listening to Uncle Jasper while he goes to bed." Mrs. Gray said, "Do the children like to go to bed at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Oh, they're very good about it, because they know that if they whine and complain, I will not let them stay up the next time Uncle Jasper comes over, which is about 4 nights a week." As the Grays had no Uncle Jasper, Mrs. Gray realized that Mrs. Grassfeather could be of no help, so she said goodbye and hung up the phone. Then she called Mrs. Gardenfield. "Hello, Mrs. Gardenfield, this is Mrs. Gray, and I called to see what time Worthington and Guinevere go to bed at night." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "Oh, they go to bed any time after Daddy comes home. You see, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Gardenfield gets home at 4:30. We have dinner at 5:30, and the children, Mr. Gardenfield and I, all go to bed at 6:30. 6:30, said Mrs. Gray, amazed. "My goodness, that is early." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "It is not early if you get up at 4:30. Mrs. Gray said, "But who wants to get up at 4:30? "We do," said Mrs. Gardenfield, and hung up the phone in a huff. So Mrs. Gray thought, and suddenly she remembered that only yesterday Dick Thompson's mother had been telling her about a wonderful little woman named Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and so, even though she had never seen Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, she decided to call her on the telephone and ask her to help with her never want to go to bedders. She said to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "I am Mrs. Gray, the mother of Bobby, Larry, and Susan." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, of course. How are the children? I have not seen them since they returned from camp." Mrs. Gray said, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Bobby and Larry and Susan are very well and very cooperative until about 8 o'clock at night, and then they turn into whiny, complaining little non-cooperators." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, I see. They are never want to go to bedders, aren't they?" Mrs. Gray said, "How on earth did you know?" Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle laughed and said, "Oh, that is one of the most commonest of the children's ailments. The moment you said they were good until 8 o'clock, I knew what the trouble was." Mrs. Gray said, "Do you know anything to do for them? How to cure this hateful disease?" Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, that's very simple. Beginning tonight, don't tell them to go to bed. Let them stay up as late as they want to. You and Mr. Gray go on to bed any time you are tired, but leave the children downstairs." Mrs. Gray said, "But their health! That will ruin their health." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, I do not believe that a day or so without sleep will harm them, and it will certainly cure them. It is really worth a try, Mrs. Gray, but if you have any trouble and the cure doesn't seem to be working, call me." Mrs. Gray said, "Oh, thank you so much, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. I will let you know tomorrow how we are getting along." That night, at 8 o'clock, the clock struck, and Mrs. Gray continued to mend socks and said nothing about bed, and Mr. Gray changed the radio, and Bobby and Larry and Susan played Parcheesi. Do you remember that part in the Doll People where, remember I told you at the beginning when I read Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle at school that this book was written a long, long time ago? 1947 is the copyright date. And remember back then, just like in the Doll People, when Auntie Sarah was first going on her adventures, people listened to the radio because they didn't have television. And so that's, again, remember, that's the time that this book was first written. So that's why Dad changed the radio. At 9 o'clock, the clock struck again, and Mrs. Gray put down the socks and took up a woman's magazine. Mr. Gray changed the radio, and Bobby and Larry and Susan continued to play Parcheesi. When 10 o'clock struck, Mrs. Gray yawned and put down the magazine. Mr. Gray snapped off the radio, and Larry and Susan and Bobby began another game of Parcheesi. At 10:30, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went upstairs to bed and left the children playing Parcheesi. At 12 o'clock, Mrs. Gray awoke and at first thought there were burglars in the house. Then she remembered the never want to go to bedders, so she tiptoed down the stairs, and there were Bobby and Larry and Susan playing Parcheesi on the living room rug. The next morning, the children slept until 11:30. About 9 o'clock, Dick Thompson's mother stopped by to take them to the beach, but Mrs. Gray told her they were still asleep. When the children finally got up, they were cross and quarrelsome. When their mother told them about Mrs. Thompson inviting them to the beach, they said, "Why didn't she wait for us? Why didn't you wake us up? I think Mrs. Thompson's mean not to wait." Mrs. Gray said, "I see no reason why Mrs. Thompson and Dick would have their day spoiled waiting for the 3 little members of the all-night Parcheesi Club to get up. Now come and eat your breakfast and stop complaining." That night after dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went to a moving picture show and left Larry and Bobby and Susan playing Tiddlywinks. That's that game where you've got little discs, and I think you have to pop them up and make them jump. When the Grays came home about 12:30, the children were still playing Tiddlywinks and quarreling about whose turn it was. The next morning they had a 9 o'clock dentist appointment, and so Mrs. Gray got them up at 8. Susan was so sleepy she could not eat her mush, and Larry yawned so much he choked on his egg and had to be turned upside down and shaken by his legs. Bobby just sat and rubbed his eyes. Bobby went to sleep in the car on the way to the dentist. Susan went to sleep in the dentist's waiting room, and Larry slept all the way home. That night, after their parents had gone to bed, Larry said, "Why do we have to stay in the house for all the time? Let's go outside and play." So they went outside and put on their roller skates and began skating up and down on the dark street. Mrs. Milgram, who lived on the corner, came out on her front porch in her bathrobe and yelled, "For heaven's sakes, don't you children know that it is almost midnight? What on earth are you doing up at this hour?" Larry said, "We don't have to go to bed anymore. We stay up late every night." Mrs. Milgram said, "Well, stay up someplace else and be quiet." She went into the house and slammed the door. So the children took off their skates and tiptoed back to the house. They got out the parcheesi board, but Susan said it was her turn for the pinks, and Larry said, "I happen to beg your pardon, but it is my turn." Susan said, "You had the pinks yesterday, and Bobby had them the day before, and it's my turn tonight." She began to cry. Larry threw the pinks at her, and one of them went into the fireplace, and they had to strain the ashes through their fingers until they found it. When they were finally ready to play, Bobby was asleep with his head on the board, so Susan and Larry played jumping their men across, hold on, there's a picture, and I'm going to read this, Bobby's head, until Susan, too, fell asleep right in the middle of her turn. Take a look at this picture. You can see Susan and Bobby with their heads down, sleeping on the game board. Larry woke Susan and Bobby, and they all went to bed just as the clock struck 1. The next day, there was a matinee at the neighborhood theater, and Mrs. Gray said they could go. It was a wonderful picture with Indians and cowboys and pioneers, and the children were very excited. But no sooner had they found their seats and settled back in the nice, dark theater, when first Susan, then Bobby, and finally Larry fell asleep. They slept peacefully through the Indian picture, a Mickey Mouse cartoon, and a newsreel. When the show was over, all the other children went home to dinner, but Larry and Susan and Bobby slept on. Susan was the first to wake up. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. Where was she? Why was it so dark? Oh, how stiff and cramped she was. She poked Larry and Bobby until they too awoke. They were frightened when they realized that they were still in the theater, now dark and empty, except for 2 rats nibbling popcorn in the front row. Susan began to cry. "Everybody's gone and left us, and we'll have to stay here until we die," she bawled. Larry said, "Oh, Susan, don't be so silly. All we have to do is walk out the door. Come on, everybody." They groped their way up the aisle to the door, but it was locked. They tried all the doors, but they were all locked. Susan began to cry again. "I'm hungry and I want to go home," she wailed. Bobby said, "I'll bet there's a back way, Larry. Let's look." Okay, so I have one question. If the movie theater shut down and the doors are all locked, wouldn't their mom and dad be trying to find them? Because it would have to be kind of late, don't you think? Always a question I have when I read this chapter. They felt their way back down the aisle again and climbed up on the stage. Then suddenly they heard the front door open. A flashlight's bold eye blinked in the darkness, and a voice said, "Hey, what's going on here? What are you kids doing?" It was Mr. Murphy, the janitor, and the children were so glad to see him that they ran and clung on his legs and all talked at once. "Oh, Mr. Murphy, we were locked in. We must have fallen asleep in the picture. What time is it? Will you let us out?" Mr. Murphy laughed at them, let them out the front door, and drove them home. Mother and Daddy were in the living room playing bridge with the Andersons and seemed not at all surprised to see the children. Mrs. Gray said, "There's bread and milk on the kitchen table. Please put everything away when you finish," and went on with her game. The children ambled out to the kitchen, but they were too tired to eat, so they went upstairs and flung themselves across their beds. After they had rested for a while, Larry suggested that they play burglar. They turned off all the upstairs lights and crept around behind doors and under beds and had a fine, scary time until Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute. Do you guys have one of those at your house? We have an upstairs, but not a clothes chute. It used to be a way so you didn't have to carry the dirty clothes up and down the stairs. You'd shove them in the chute and they'd fall directly down to the basement. Maybe some of you have one. But it was for clothes. And Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute. And now I have to find my place. Oh. Larry pushed Bobby down the clothes chute and Bobby stuck. And Susan screamed and Daddy came upstairs and yanked Bobby out, spanked them all, and sent them to their rooms. Susan and Bobby got right into bed and went to sleep, but Larry stayed awake until the guests had gone home and their mother and Daddy had gone to bed. Then he pinched Bobby awake and they both sneaked into Susan's room and pulled off her covers. Larry said, "Let's go downstairs and see if there are any sandwiches or cookies left." Susan was very sleepy when she said, "Oh, all right." They ate about 10 little sandwiches, a small dish of salted nuts, 2 little dishes of candy, some olives and pickles, and some chocolate marshmallow cake. They felt very lively after that, so they sat down at the bridge table and began playing slapjack. When they finished the last game, the birds were singing, and they heard the thump of the morning paper on the porch. They scurried up to bed quickly. The next day was Patsy's birthday. It was a wonderful party with a fish pond and a magician who did tricks and games and balloons and prizes for every child. But Larry and Bobby and Susan did not enjoy it at all. Susan had such big black circles under her eyes that Patsy's mother thought she was sick and would not let her have any refreshments. Bobby was so sleepy he fell asleep just as the magician pulled a rabbit from under his chair, and the magician thought Bobby was so rude he gave the rabbit to Hubert Prentice. Larry fell asleep right at the table. He laid his cheek in his ice cream, closed his eyes, and dreamed he was in the North Pole. Patsy's mother called all the others to look at him, and he awoke, very embarrassed. That night, when 8 o'clock came, Mr. and Mrs. Gray were working on the budget and not saying much, and Susan and Larry and Bobby were sitting on the Davenport, another word for couch, pinching each other to keep awake. At last the clock struck. Bong, 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 bong. The children jumped up and rushed over to their mother and father. They said, "It is 8 o'clock and time for bed. Please let us go to bed. Please don't make us stay up anymore. Please." Mrs. Gray said, "Why, I thought you enjoyed staying up late. I thought all the children in this neighborhood stayed up late." The children said, "Nobody has to stay up late but us. We just hate it. May we go to bed, please?" Mrs. Gray said, "Very well, children. From now on, if you are good, I will let you go to bed at 8 o'clock every night." I counted before I read this chapter, and we only have 2 more chapters. Chapter 7 is another fun one to read. It's called The Slow Eater Tiny Bite Taker. 2 more chapters. And then Mrs. Weidlich will start reading The Meanest Doll in the World. Hope you have a great Thursday, and we'll see you later.